Welcome to the Deeper Learning Theology course. This week we'll be looking at the historical books of the Bible. That's all the way from it's Joshua right through to 2 Kings, includes 1 and 2 Chronicles, Nehemiah, Ezra, and Esther and Ruth. So it's that volume of books. And as you can imagine, that's a lot to get through in 1 week. And so what we're going to do is this week we will just look at the different aspects of the books. We'll look at the setting of the books and then unpack it from there. To start, I'd like to share a story that I hope doesn't get me into too much trouble. It's a story of when I was 12 years old. I was 12 years old and I have to confess that I started smoking. So I smoked with my brother, my older brother. Him and I used to go jogging around the block, or at least that's what we pretended to do. And we would jog past the neighbor's house knowing that they would bust us. And as soon as we passed the neighbor, we would stop and we'd light up our cigarettes and then we would walk the rest of the way. This happened for not very long, and by the time I got to high school, I stopped smoking. When I was 16 years old, 16 or 17, around about there, my mother found a letter that was written by my brother's girlfriend. And my brother's girlfriend in this letter had told my brother that he was influencing me, and that's why I started smoking. As you can imagine, my mom found this letter and automatically came to me and started questioning me about it and everything, and my response was that I started to laugh. I don't know about you, but the last thing you do when your parents are upset with you is laugh at them. But the reason I started to laugh is because I said to my mom, you don't understand, that letter was old. It was probably written 3 or 4 years ago, and situation had changed, and I no longer smoked. And every time when I try and study the Old Testament, I remember that story of my life. You see, in that particular story, there's 3 different settings that happened. The first one is the time in which that letter was set. That was when I was 12 years old. It's when I was walking with my brother smoking. That's what the letter was about. But the letter was only written after that by my brother's girlfriend. It was after I had already started smoking, so it was written after the fact, and my mom only discovered it years later. And so there's 3 different times, like lines, if I could put it that way, stages in time in which this letter is unpacked. Whenever I think of the Old Testament, I think of that. I think that there's a time in which the Old Testament was set. In other words, the story tells us about that time. There's a time in which it was written, so people get together and they wrote down that history, and then there's a time when it's read. Every one of these 3 different times influence the outcome of that letter. See, so if my mom had discovered the letter, if my brother's girlfriend had written the letter as I started smoking, and my mom had discovered the letter as I started smoking, it would have been in the same time period. But that isn't what happened. It was 3 different time periods. And that's how it is with the Old Testament, is there's 3 different time periods that we deal with. We deal with our time, a couple of thousand years later as we read it. That influences how we read it and what the outcome is. We deal with the time in which it was written, and we deal with the time in which it was set. Now this week we're looking at the historical writings, and even though they're called historical writings, it does not mean that it was meant to be a historical textbook. It's religious writings about the history. And if we can remember that, it helps us so much in interpreting Scripture. It is a religious reflection on historical events. And so, if I could divide it into 3 different sections, these books, there were some books that were written in the exile. So when Babylon had come and conquered Jerusalem and people were sent to exile, that was when the Deuteronomists, remember the Deuteronomist? He or they reflected and edited the first 5 books of the Bible. So their editing and their history actually carries on after that. And it covers Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and 1 and 2 Kings. Then we have books that were written at a later stage and books that were written at an even later stage. And we'll uncover these 3 different stages in which these historical books came about. But to start, I thought let's look at the first lot, this lot that it covers from Joshua through to 2 Kings. And what we're going to do is I'd like to just discuss briefly the setting of the stories, in other words, what the storyline was, then discover a little bit about when it was written, and then we'll do that with the other sections as well. And so if I start, Joshua, the Deuteronomist in the first 5 books of the Bible, has ended with the death of Moses. Moses has now died, and the book of Joshua starts telling the story from that moment. And what happens is Joshua takes over the leadership of these Israelites that have been wandering in the desert. And he leads them into the promised land. Now, the entering into the promised land was miraculous. It wasn't just a good army strategy. It was surrounded by these miraculous stories. Just listen to this one. In Joshua chapter 3, from verse 14. So when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant went ahead of them. Now the Jordan is at flood stage all during harvest, yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap, a great distance away, at a town called Adam in the vicinity of Zarethan, while the water flowing down to the sea of Arabah, the salt sea, was completely cut off. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. The priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stood firm on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan, while all of Israel passed by until the whole nation had completed the crossing on dry ground. That is how they enter the promised land. Do you see how this historical event, it just kind of mirrors the Exodus from Egypt? It's like it shows the people that Joshua is the new Moses. Joshua, like Moses parted the Red Sea, Joshua has organized that the Jordan stops flowing and people can cross over into the promised land. And that's how it goes for the rest of Joshua. The rest of this book describes how the Israelites go into the promised land. They take the promised land. They do that through the walking around of the walls of Jericho. You know, we know these stories, where they marched once every day for 6 days, and on the 7th day, they marched around 7 times, and the walls came tumbling down. It goes on to tell how they now started to settle in this promised land. Now you can imagine what's happening as they're settling, is that this land belonged to other people. And as they're trying to settle, the people that originally lived there are going like, but this is our land. And so wars break out throughout the book of Joshua. And all of them, the Israelites win over and they conquer, and eventually they settle in the promised land. One of the famous war stories is where the sun stands still as Joshua and the Israelites fight against their enemies in order to settle in this land. And that's the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua takes us through when Joshua takes over from Moses as the people enter into the promised land, and then it describes how they settle and how Joshua divides the promised land in amongst the 12 tribes of Israel. And that's the story of Joshua. Judges then carries on from that and describes how the people started to become settled. Now, these were nomads. They'd wandered in the wilderness, and now they had to settle in a promised land. And the book of Judges takes us through that time period. Now, bearing in mind that the book of Judges, I think language is a problem. So sometimes when I previously used to read Judges or hear about a judge in the book of Judges, I assume it means someone who stands there and goes, this is right and this is wrong, someone who upholds the law. But that's not what the role of the judges were in the time of the judges. You see, what happened is now we have these nomadic people who have settled in this promised land. They're starting to farm the land, and they now need to become a nation. And so what was important in those days, as I've shared earlier, is families. Now, the family that they used to live in, so they all lived in families, and then those families are grouped together, would make a clan, and those clans would then make a tribe. And then we have the 12 tribes of Israel. It's helpful to remember that families in those days were not families like we have. So we have families that live in houses, and it's generally the father, the mother, the children. And as the children grow up, they leave the house, they get married, they have their children, and it's very seldom that they even live close to each other, let alone in the same house. Whereas in this period, during the time of the judges, it was different. You would have a patriarch, so the oldest male of the family would have a house, and then every member of the family lived with him. So it would be the patriarch and his wife or wives. It would be their children. And when their children got older and married, then the sons and their wives would live in the same house. And when their children would live with them, and when their children got married, then those sons and their wives would live in the house. And so it would go generation after generation. And so you would have this main patriarch in a family, and then generations after him. Included in that would then be the odd slave or two, visitors, strangers who were in the land, and even distant family members who perhaps didn't have families of their own would then live with them. So you can imagine when it speaks about family in the Old Testament, it was family. It was big families, all living together, working the land together. And the bigger your family, the richer you were. Goes on that these families, with these patriarchs, would then live in clans. And often because they lived close to each other, they would intermarry, not intermarry in the weird way, but intermarry. So this family and that family, they would often have marriages between them. And so this clan were related and often had a lot to do together as a clan. And then the clans would gather, and they would be a tribe, which was generally geographical, and they were obviously all related. Now these 12 tribes, they didn't work in the sense that they had one ruler over all of them. They didn't have a government that they elected. They didn't have elders that were voted in. What would happen is when anything went wrong, whether it was that there was some kind of judgment that had to happen, when there was some kind of ruling or disobedience, when somebody broke the laws of God, when any of those things happened, when decisions needed to be made, the patriarchs of all these families in this clan, they would gather, often in public spaces, and they would decide what to do. And so all of the government, all of the laws, everything, the decisions were all made by these patriarchs within the clans. And it was very seldom that the clans had to gather as a tribe. It was even more seldom that the tribes gathered as a nation. And that's how they settled in the promised land. But what would happen is that obviously, because they were in the promised land and everybody wanted this land, their neighboring nations would often fight the Israelites to try and gain monopoly over that land. At this point in history, the big nations, Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, they aren't on the scene. They're dealing with their own crises at this point. And so the smaller nations are fighting against each other to gain monopoly of the land, hoping to become stronger. And every time a massive threat arose, or every time the Israelites were conquered by another nation, it was then that a judge appeared. So God would call somebody, and this person would rally all the different people throughout the tribes. They would try and get them together. They would try and get an army together, and they would lead them in warfare. They would lead them to defeat the enemies of Israel. That's what a judge was. Think of Deborah, who led the Israelites into victory. Think of Gideon. You know the story of Gideon, where he had an army and he had to make it smaller and smaller and smaller. Samson was the last judge that was there. And he was there to try and defeat the Philistines who had control of the Israelites. And so these judges, that whole book is the period of this, as they're trying to settle in the promised land. And these are a bunch of farmers. They were nomads trying to settle in a land that everyone wanted. We get to the end of Judges, and we start the book of Samuel. And what has happened is Samuel has been called by God. He's a prophet. He influences all these different tribes. they look to him for a certain level of leadership. And they start saying to him, as obviously these patriarchs, these clans, these tribes, they start saying to him that we actually want a king. They say all the other nations around us have kings. They have kings, and so they have professional armies, because when their king is there, he can control an army. And we're a bunch of farmers gathering every now and then to try and fight these professionals. And so they approach Samuel and say that they want a king. And Samuel says to them, I'm paraphrasing everything. I'm making everything condensed. I mean, this is 5 or 6 books of the Bible. And Samuel says to them, he says to them that if they have a king, they will be slaves to that king. He says the king will use your daughters. He will bring them in as his wives, his concubines, his maids. They will use your sons. He'll bring them in and force them to be in the army. He says the king will take the best land and he'll charge you taxes. And you will end up being slaves to this king. But the people decide it's in their best interest. They want a king. And so after a long process, Saul is anointed as king of Israel. Saul he was a good king, but he wasn't the best. As we read his story, we watch him deteriorate, and it's almost like he allowed fear and he allowed popular opinion to influence him more than God and God's direction, and he slowly loses power. As the story shows how Saul loses power, it highlights how David rises. And eventually David is king. And David was the best king that Israel had ever seen. This was considered Israel's glory days. It is considered that Israel would never again be as big, as strong, as influential as in the time of David. And David was a fantastic king. He was clever from an economic perspective, from a social perspective, from a political perspective, and a religious perspective. And so when he finally becomes king of both the south and the north tribes, all 12 tribes, when he is finally king, he is so clever that he takes neutral ground. He conquers a city that we now know as Jerusalem, takes it as neutral ground and sets up everything in this town. He sets up the political center, the religious center, the military center is all in this neutral town of Jerusalem. And so he unites all of the tribes, gets a professional army in, starts to rally all the people so that everyone's united, and the kingdom of Israel thrives. David obviously had his own issues, which we won't be discussing in this video. But after David comes his son, Solomon. Solomon was the son of Bathsheba, and Solomon comes into power, and his kingdom was almost as good as David's, but he had a different perspective. Where David was very strong in terms of military, in terms of politics, religion, Solomon had a passion for building. And we can still see today, if you go to Israel, you can still see the ruins of some of the buildings that Solomon built. He was passionate about building, and so builds a temple, builds a palace, builds walls. He builds different gates at different cities. He just does this extensive building project throughout Israel. But as most of you know, building is expensive. And it was expensive then as well. And so Solomon, in order to fund his building, obviously had to start taxing the people more. And the people of the north started feeling like they were heavier taxed than the people of the south. And when Solomon eventually dies and his son comes into power, his son is from the southern tribes, and the people in the north start calling them on this. They start saying, but you guys are treating the southern tribes better than us. We're paying more taxes than you are. We're funding your developments. We're being treated badly, and there's a split. And eventually the northern kingdom completely splits from the south, and they have their own king. It's at this point that the history of 1 and 2 kings then follows both these tribes, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And it follows every king over and over and describes every king and what they did and how they behaved and what happened in their lifetime. And it follows it all the way through. Now, the northern kingdom, they had their own challenges. They didn't have a temple like the southern kingdom, and so they were constantly influenced by different religions in the north. Their capital was Samaria. They also didn't have a clear lineage of kings, and so they often had a general or somebody that was rising up to power would assassinate the king and would take over, and so there was all this unrest all the time in the north. The southern kingdom had its own challenges, but it was also a little bit more stable, in the sense that the southern kingdom, they had the line of David, and so only if David was your great-great-great-grandfather were you able to become king. And so they had more stability in their leadership. They also had the temple, and so they had more stability in their religion. The north and the south, they had this love-hate relationship that sometimes, depending on who the kings were, sometimes they loved each other and they worked together. Other times they were at war with one another. As this is happening and all these little kingdoms around Palestine are finding their feet, in world history, the Assyrians are rising to power. The Assyrians start rising to power and they start dominating all of these little nations throughout the Fertile Crescent. And as they start dominating, something happens, and it's quite horrible, but the northern kingdom and some neighboring towns or neighboring nations decided to rise up and rebel against the Assyrians. They tried to force the southern kingdom to join allies with them, to join them in this fight. And the southern kingdom, instead of joining them, ran to the Assyrian king and said, "Those people are trying to rebel, but we are loyal." The Assyrians came in and annihilated all of those nations, one of them being the northern kingdom's Israel. The Assyrians were also clever. What they did is that they dispersed everyone. So they took a nation and they just crossed everyone. So they would move all of the people from the northern kingdom into different nations and people from those nations into the northern kingdom. And they jumbled it up so much that the northern kingdom would never again be a kingdom on its own. And that's why, so they were Samaritans, their capital was Samaria, and that's why in the time of Jesus, the Jews disliked the Samaritans so much because they considered them a mixed breed. They weren't quite Jewish, according to the southern kingdom. The southern kingdom continues for a while, and they live through the Assyrian power. But then two other nations start rising to power on the world scene, and that was the Egyptians and the Babylonians. The Egyptians and the Babylonians are growing in strength, and in Judea, there's a split. Half the people believe that they should side with the Egyptians, and half the people think they should side with the Babylonians. Jeremiah was one of those who said they need to side with the Babylonians or they would be destroyed, and no one listened to him. But we'll cover the prophets in a week or two's time. In the meantime, what the Jews did, the Judeans, is they sided with the Egyptians against the Babylonians. And when they realized that the Babylonians were on their way to take over Jerusalem, they cried out to Egypt for help, and Egypt never arrived. And so they held Jerusalem in siege. It was one of the worst sieges that you can imagine. People were literally starved to death. If you read about the siege, the scenes are horrific. As how people had to turn to forms of cannibalism. They had to turn to whatever they could do in order to survive the siege, and eventually they were destroyed. The temple was destroyed, people were dispersed, and the Babylonians came in and took all the rich, the powerful, the influential, the leaders, and they withdrew this elite group of people and sent them to Babylon. It's quite clever because you can imagine Babylon is going to thrive because they have entrepreneurial people with wealth. Whereas Jerusalem is going to struggle because there's nobody there equipped to build it up again. And that's the period of the exile. Now that period of the exile, that's where a lot of our writings come from. That people then gathered and decided we must write down our history now, we'll lose it forever. They decided in this season we can't lose our identity, we can't lose our religion, we can't lose our faith, we can't lose our heritage. And so they wrote down the histories. It was in that time period that the Deuteronomists, then wrote down this history that we've just gone through, which was they edited the 5 books and they went right through Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, right up until the period of the exile. It's also in that time period that we'll see some of the prophets wrote. And so as we reflect on these books, please remember those 3 aspects. Remember that there was a time in which it was set. There was a time in which it was written down, and there's a time in which it is read. And each one of those times influence our interpretation. Thank you.